Hi there, and welcome to Green Shoe Conversations, episode 29. I'm Stephanie Cochran, the executive director for the Green Shoe Foundation, and I'm so excited to bring you our weekly podcast that we are doing. And with me, I've got my entire team. So I want to say welcome to everybody. If you don't know, the fabulous Miss Teresa Duck is our clinical director. Then we've got Mr. Stephen Brinkworth. He's one of our therapists. And over here, I've got Miss Rebecca Holt, one of our other therapists. How are y'all doing?
Doing good.
Good. So
Wow.
I'm really hoping we'll make sure we see this. And again, it goes into our model of being perfectly imperfect, that as I'm pointing, it's recording the way that my screen shows. Nobody's confused. But if not, hey, that's part of it. So I'm so glad you guys are getting to join me. I'm missing your faces. We are all kind of working from home right now as we're entering into the holidays, just being extra cautious during our COVID time. But last week, we kind of started on a topic that's been very relevant lately. I know I've been seeing a lot of things about it. And since we started the conversation last week talking about grief and loss, it's been interesting the feedback we've been getting. A lot of people have questions, and I've been kind of excited to hear more in some of the resources and topics we were talking about. So just to kind of recap, we just really touched on it last week and talked about the different kind of types of grief and loss and what all that means. And Teresa, can you kind of help us out and kind of summarize again for us kind of what grief is?
Certainly. Grief is a loss of something or someone or some position, but it's a loss of something that it was valuable to you. And it's that feeling and emotion of sadness. But there's also a lot of different emotions that go along with grief. There's some anger. We can even deny that we're grieving and that the loss made a difference to us. There's bargaining, and and finally we get to the point of acceptance, but that doesn't always come all at once. It's a gradual experience, and it's a road. It's a trip. It's a destination, and we're never fully there. We continue to grieve years after we've lost something sometime, but we can accept, and we have hope, and we can go on and look forward to the future is when we finally get to that point of acceptance.
And that's what we kind of want to spend some time today talking about, is those stages of grief. And I know here in a minute, Rebecca, you're going to talk about the task of mourning and kind of a little bit more details about what all of that is and what it can mean. And when we talk about grief, like you said, Teresa, it's the loss of something valuable. That can be the loss of a loved one, loss of a job, in this pandemic, loss of connection with people. So I think that term grief can mean so many different things for people now. That they're relating to. So Rebecca, kind of talk to us a little bit about this task of mourning.
Yeah, so he's a grief, I guess, therapist, William Worden. He came up with the task of mourning. So in grief, we experience certain emotions, but really when he talks about grief in mourning, that it's an active thing that we do. We participate in the task of mourning. And so I was going to go over those a little bit. And we talked a lot about acceptance, but that's the first step. Accept the reality of the loss. And sometimes, Teresa, you touched on that, but sometimes it comes in waves, sometimes it's that first time that person's not there, or, that they're not calling, or they're not coming through the door. That can be a little piece of acceptance. I know sometimes in COVID and some of the grief we're experiencing now, there's been moments where I'm working at home and I have to just go through, this is where I work now. Just kind of an acceptance of this. This isn't temporary. This is just what it is for the moment. I don't know what this looks like for all of us, but going through that acceptance. The other thing with acceptance is a lot of times there's the head and the heart. So it's like you intellectually know it, but emotionally it's hard to feel it. Your heart still experiences some of those pains of that person every time, they're not there, accepting that reality. And so that would be the first task, is to go through acceptance. The next one is to process the pain. And we've talked about, you have a right to feel your pain, allowing yourself to feel that pain. I think that this one looks different for everyone. A big part of that is learning about grief reactions, learning about when your body does things, when your emotions do things, and being aware of that, finding someone to talk to and process, whether that's a friend, a therapist, a support group. That's huge. And the other part is pain comes emotionally, it comes physically, it can come in spiritual forms, in grief. And so sometimes allowing yourself, like, this is what I'm feeling right now. I'm going to allow myself to feel this pain, not just distract myself from it. Because a lot of times we don't want to feel that reality when it doesn't feel good, but staying present with the pain. The next task is to adjust to a world without that person. Sometimes that's taking on new responsibilities. Adjusting to a world without something, us not going to the office, we have to adjust to working at home, not seeing each other every day. Sometimes, whenever a person has been in your life, they played a significant role and they're not there anymore, we might have to take on some responsibilities that we never had before. Identifying what those are, what does my world look like now that this person's gone? And then with that, adjusting, exploring an identity. So who am I now? If you've had a significant loss in your life, there's always a shift in identity. I hear this a lot of times whenever people go through divorce. It's kind of an identity shift. Who am I now? That loss of a relationship can bring that on too. And the last task of mourning is finding an enduring connection while embarking on a new life. And so this is where, we've talked about finding meaning after grief, in grief. So honoring that person. It's not that I'm embarking on this new life, forgetting about that pain or that person, but I'm embracing that while also being able to adjust and flourish in this new identity. Be in my life while still experiencing that grief. And so those are the tasks of mourning. And I think that those are good. Sometimes we don't always consciously participate in these tasks, but sometimes when we take a look at this, it's like, oh, I can see where I'm at. That's what that was, or that's what I've accomplished. And years later, you can look at it and say, this is how I've done this task, how I continue to do it.
So, and you wrote a blog about this too, about the task of mourning. So again,
Yeah.
if you're listening, you've kind of put some of this down in writing. I want to go back to, you talked about this is an active process, not a passive, process. And sometimes it may feel like we're being passive, but that is how we're actively dealing with the loss.
Yeah. I think there's different messages we get about grief. Just move on, or, you just go back to life as it was when life is clearly not like it was. And so this is a way, again, to be active in that, not just set it aside, because it's going to come out one way or another, whether we want it or not.
And sometimes we didn't learn that grief was active. We just learned that we suck it up, don't talk about them, and go on. That's what we learned in childhood. And so how can we learn how to do healthy grief and mourn in a healthy way when those around you don't allow you to do that? So that sometimes is a challenge to say, I'm going to cry when I feel sad and feel like crying, to express my grief. And I'm going to bring them up at the dinner table when no one else wants to talk about. There's a chair with nobody sitting in it now, and I'm missing them. I'm going to bring it up, what I'm feeling. And so the actively engaged in your healing process. So
yeah, grief is oftentimes that elephant in the room. But I think whenever you point out that elephant, it's a lot easier to deal with that reality. It doesn't take away the pain, but it can be a little bit easier to deal with it.
Right. You talk about you're honoring that, whether it's the person or the loss, you're honoring what you've lost. But by doing that, it's fascinating. Kessler says you're honoring yourself, which gets into that whole, we have the right to go through this active process. You really talk about the feeling or the emotion pain. And, Teresa, I want to kind of tie into something you said a minute ago about, grief is like a lot of different feelings. It can be pain, it can be anger, it can even be fear. But one thing that we know from our model is all of these feelings have gifts. So having that feeling of pain, and again, this was, when I was reading your blog, it made me think about, well, by having the pain and actively going through the grief, then I'm getting to the healing and the growth and the awareness part. And even with the anger, it provides the assertiveness that I might need, like you said, Teresa, to say, no, I have the right to do this. So those give us those gifts as we go through this.
Our emotions do bring us gifts, and sadness, even though, as Rebecca said, we don't want to deal with it. Sometimes we want to just, in our society, we want to do anything so we don't feel that pain. So we stay busy, or we cook, or we drink, or we use drugs, or we work, or whatever, just not to feel the pain. But that doesn't help keep that moving so that it allows us to mature and grow from our experience, to grow and mature. And so when we want to keep our kids from pain, we're keeping them, not allowing them to grow and mature and to deal with the hard things, because you get old enough and you're going to experience losses.
Mhm. Mhm. I oftentimes, when I talk about grief and the gifts of it, sometimes I say grief is a beautiful emotion, which sometimes I get an eyebrow raised out of that. But we grieve because we love so deeply most of the time. We grieve because we had a connection in our life that was meaningful. And so, because we had that, we experience pain when we lose that.
Mm-hmm. And so
I
then,
think about those stages that we go through, and with getting to that stage of depression, there's a sense of finality with the loss as I get to that stage, and being able to sit with that pain doesn't mean I'm staying in that space forever, but that I can feel that pain, honor that loss, honor the love and the connection that I had, and be able to move from that depression into acceptance.
Mhm.
So it doesn't mean that I like that person or that part of my life has changed or it's gone, but I can heal, I can grow, I can be aware of what I need to in the process. So I can get in touch with each of those gifts of that pain as I'm allowed to be in touch with it. And it may be myself that tries to keep me from feeling that pain, just like you mentioned, Teresa, with all those different distractions I may find myself trying to engage in. It may be others that are trying to tell me that I should be over this already.
Mm-hmm.
And so there can be different pieces that when we're in that process of grief, to have that interrupted also interrupts our process of healing.
well, so Steve, talk more about the stages of grief. You mentioned the depression. Kind of go through and talk about the 5 stages.
So with these 5, and we each took a chance, well, not a chance, we each took a turn in writing our blogs. And so we each kind of touch on different pieces with this. So I would definitely encourage you to check out each of those blogs on our website. The first stage that we get into in the 5 stages of grief is denial. And this can be an avoidance of the reality of that change. So that denial may be something that's internal. It may be a distraction that I engage in to not face that reality. I may compartmentalize it and put it aside, and that this isn't really going on. This can't be true. As we move from that denial, or move out of that denial, we may move into anger. And so with anger, there may be anger that surfaces in the way that I'm angry that the person is gone. I'm angry that this has changed. I may be angry at myself for something I feel I should have done or could have done. So that anger can surface in a number of different ways. Bargaining is the third of those stages. And with bargaining, I may be trying to make a bargain with God, a bargain with the universe that, well, if I do this, then this will happen. If I do X, Y, and Z, then the pain can subside. If I do this, then maybe they'll come back. There's a lot of different ways that bargaining takes place. With depression, like I mentioned, that sense of finality. We've gotten to a place where I realize they're really gone. And to feel that loss, to grieve, to mourn, to be sad about what's changed, and allow those emotions to flow. And we may go back and forth. This is not a linear process. So we may I used to draw this on a board in a circle so that it wasn't in a list. and we kind of move back and forth between those. So as we are able to experience and process that depression, we'll move into acceptance. And with acceptance, like I mentioned earlier, it doesn't mean that we like what happened, but I acknowledge the truth of this reality of what's taken place. And so as opposed to being in that depression, with acceptance, I'm now looking forward. I'm no longer trying to live in the past. I'm no longer trying to focus on how things once were and trying to maintain that previous state of being, but moving forward with this reality. Just like Rebecca was mentioning about working from home. This is how things are, and being able to accept that this is what's taking place currently, and I'm not going back to try and make home look like or be like my office or do everything in the same way, but that this is my current reality. And so we move through those 5 stages in a way that's true to us, and we may be having multiple aspects of grief that we're dealing with at the same time. And so I may find myself bouncing between different stages due to different types of grief.
And
And
just because
different
I get,
stimuli. I'm sorry.
oh no, go ahead, Teresa.
I would say, and different stimuli at different time, because you may be just fine and think you've accepted, and you drive by somewhere that you went to dinner with, or stayed with somewhere, or just something comes on TV and it reminds you of, and that may put you in one of the stages that you have already been in, and you find yourself back in there, and that's a very natural thing to happen.
Teresa, one of the things that brings up for me is thinking about when I've been busy and active with something and going through the day-to-day pieces and walk into the grocery store. And one of the first pieces in that grocery store that I've seen is the card section. And be face to face with the holiday that's a first in that missing.
Yes.
It may be a Father's Day, it may be a Christmas, it may be any number of cards that may be for a Hallmark sales time, but for me it may be a first memory, and all of a sudden that's hitting me with a wave in the grocery store because I've been so distracted and in that denial.
And the holidays can do that for a lot of us, can bring up,
Yes.
you know, some reminders of old traditions that, or like you said, Christmas tree ornaments, I think we talked about last week. Those can be activators that bring that up for us.
And this Christmas is going to look very different, like our Thanksgiving did. And so how can we do that in a healthy way and still focus on the meaning of Christmas, and not what we've lost, but the gifts that grieving brings, and the gifts that Christmas brings. And yeah, it's going to be a different Christmas season.
And we're also in a time we've never been in before with this pandemic. And, you know, we were kind of talking, and Teresa, I was going to have you kind of talk about how the stages of grief, we can kind of see that through COVID. And I know we were listening to Kessler had a very interesting conversation where he brought this up and talked about the denial, the bargaining, you know, and how do we get to the acceptance of the new reality? And so we see those stages in this pandemic.
And I love how Kessler called it collective grief. And it compounds our grief, because also, and Rebecca brought up a great point a little earlier before we started this, was we can't really work through that grief because we're still in the middle of grieving. We're still in the middle of trying to accept that we've lost how many thousands of individuals who we've known and loved, and we've lost our freedom to have families, have parties at Christmas time. We've lost our freedom. So we're still in the middle of that situation that's traumatic for us. It's trauma. It's something that our brain says, this isn't normal and I don't feel safe. When we don't feel safe going to the grocery store or having Christmas parties, we're still in the middle of that trauma. And so, and everybody is experiencing that, except some people who have not, are in that denial. Oh, well, this won't affect me, or this won't matter to me. It might not to you, but it might to your grandmother or somebody else that you come in contact with if you're not careful about if you have COVID and are positive. And so this pandemic has impacted us collectively and individually. And so being able to accept that life is different right now, but there is hope that it's not going to go on forever, and that we will be able to get back to a different world. It will be different. I've heard so many professionals say the world after this is going to be different, but it will, then we'll be able to more look at, I think, and take account of what we've lost, and deal with that at that time.
And there's now this concept too of the sixth stage, the finding meaning.
Yes.
And I think this is something that we've done as a team, especially not just, I know we talked about it last month in our podcast, but really since this started is kind of helping each other find our gratitude. And to me, that's connected it, because there has been some things that have come out of this pandemic, being able to spend more time with family, and make some connections and do some things that I'm very grateful for that I would not have had. And so I think trying to, find that meeting has given, maybe helped in that acceptance is a good way of putting it, or at least for me that has, with that. So I want to encourage everybody, because you guys y'all wrote blogs talking more about these topics and totally different. Steve, you talked more about the stages and type of grief. Rebecca talking about the task of mourning, which you talked about earlier. And Teresa, I think the biggest thing that I loved about your blog is just the compassion. And that was the word I kept pulling out of that. So I want to encourage folks to go and read those and get more information on that. Again, if people are needing support too, we've been putting this out. Grief.com is a great website with active support groups that are free that you can get involved with. They just also have some great articles and information too that can help support locally. Calm Waters still is having their grief groups meet virtually, but they're, again, very, very active. Finding ways to connect. Here's another thing that happened today I know for me in particular, our amazing social media director, Amanda, who we don't get on here enough, came up with the idea that as a Green Shoe team, we were going to come up with a Christmas playlist. Did y'all see that email that went around? I thought that was such a great idea, but when she sent it out, I cannot tell you the joy I had reading through the songs and knowing that this is going to be something I get to listen to that came from all of you. And that joy that brings. So I kind of wanted to end on that note. It's on Spotify, so it's a Green Shoe Christmas playlist. So we're adding to it, but anybody can listen to that and know that these are our favorite Christmas songs that we're going to have. So next week, we want to kind of talk about switching perspectives, is still talking about grief, but what do I do if I'm wanting to help somebody going through grief? Whether it's a friend, a family member, a coworker, that's always the biggest question. What do I do? And so we want to spend some time to talk about that perspective. So we hope you guys will join us. Any parting words, guys? Anything else we want to share out there?
I think just connecting to yourself and listening to yourself and checking in with yourself daily. What am I noticing? What am I feeling? I think that's really important. And if you notice that it's pain or sadness or anger, whatever it is, do something to express that in a healthy way.
Absolutely. Thank you, Teresa. And guys, thanks for joining me. And if you need to reach us, make sure you check out our website at greenshoe.org for all those awesome blogs that we've talked about today. You can also email info@greenshoe.org, and we will see you guys next week.